Fear does not always knock on the door. Sometimes it sends an email wrapped in courtesy, softened with careful phrasing and polished restraint. Sometimes it smiles before it speaks, calling itself concern while quietly rearranging the ground beneath a family's feet. And sometimes, in the quietest homes, the moment everything begins to change is the moment a father decides not to react. That decision, calm and invisible, can alter the course of everything that follows. Daniel Morgan had built his life on reading what others overlooked. As a compliance analyst, he spent his days studying institutional language, tracing inconsistencies in policy, understanding how systems protected themselves when pressure mounted. He was not dramatic. He did not believe in loud authority. He believed in structure, timing, and patience. At home, he carried that same steadiness into the rhythms of family life. He listened more than he spoke. He observed more than he revealed. He believed that dignity was strongest when it did not have to announce itself. Claire Morgan balanced him with warmth that felt effortless. She noticed shifts in tone the way some people notice changes in weather. She created softness in their home without weakening its foundation. Their daughter, Ava Morgan, reflected both parents in different ways. She carried Daniel's discipline and Claire's quiet empathy. Her scholarship at Hawthorne Ridge Preparatory was not inherited or purchased, it was earned through years of focused effort. She had worked late without complaint, competed without arrogance, and succeeded without drawing unnecessary attention. Hawthorne Ridge was known for its polish. Its red brick buildings framed manicured lawns and carefully preserved traditions. Alumni plaques lined the entrance hall, engraved with names that now held influence in courtrooms, boardrooms, and government offices. Reputation was not discussed loudly at Hawthorne Ridge because it did not need to be. It lived in the architecture, in the carefully curated newsletters, in the way parents spoke about acceptance letters as if they were inheritances. Families did not challenge Hawthorne Ridge. They trusted it. They believed it elevated their children. When the email arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, its subject line read Student Wellbeing Discussion. The tone was gentle, almost nurturing. It referenced partnership, balance, and community standards. The word concern appeared twice, positioned delicately between phrases about supporting scholarship students and maintaining academic excellence. It requested a meeting within 24 hours. Claire felt something tighten inside her chest as she reread the message. Not panic, but unease. The timing felt abrupt. Ava had just returned from a regional academic decathlon, carrying solid results and no disciplinary notice. No teacher had reached out before. No warning had been issued. Yet the meeting was urgent. Daniel read the email once, then again more slowly. He did not react outwardly. He noted the language. He noticed how the phrases were arranged. He registered the subtle emphasis on standards and the repeated reference to institutional care. Something about it did not align with the quiet normalcy of the previous week. At the meeting, Headmaster Richard Caldwell greeted them with a measured smile that never quite shifted from its practice position. Beside him sat Meredith Langford, Assistant Director of Student Affairs, her posture composed, a closed folder resting carefully in front of her. The room overlooked the central courtyard where students moved in orderly lines, unaware of the conversation unfolding above them. The administrators spoke softly. They referenced observations made during the decathlon trip. They described perceived stress indicators, subtle behavioral shifts, a need to ensure Ava was not overwhelmed by scholarship expectations. The words were calm, even reassuring. They emphasized protection, partnership, and shared goals. Yet there were no documents presented. No specific examples offered. No clear infraction identified. The conversation drifted toward reputation without stating it directly. Hawthorne Ridge valued stability. Hawthorne Ridge prioritized community alignment. Hawthorne Ridge maintained high standards. The scholarship program, they explained gently, required balance and maturity. The implications settled slowly, instability could affect status. Claire maintained composure, though her protective instinct stirred beneath the surface. Ava listened quietly, confusion flickering in her expression. She had followed every rule. She had competed with discipline. The suggestion that her dedication might signal fragility felt misplaced. Daniel said very little. He observed how Meredith avoided direct eye contact when referencing written observations. He noticed how Richard leaned forward slightly when mentioning the Academy's long-standing reputation. He felt the rhythm of the conversation, its soft pressure, its careful framing. Something feels off. He did not voice the thought. He held it. The meeting concluded with reassurance. Nothing formal had been initiated. The Academy simply cared deeply about its students. They appreciated open communication. Their smiles remained consistent until the Morgans stepped into the hallway. In the car ride home, silence filled the space between them. Claire spoke gently about possibilities, wondering whether Ava had appeared more serious than usual. Ava questioned herself quietly, replaying moments from the trip in her mind. Daniel focused on the road, his thoughts aligning rather than racing. That evening, after dinner plates were cleared and the house settled into quiet, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a legal pad. He wrote down the exact language used in the meeting. He recorded the time the email had been sent. He noted the absence of written documentation during the discussion. He printed the email thread and placed it into a simple folder. He created a digital archive labeled HRP. He did not accuse. He did not confront. Silence, for him, was not retreat. It was preparation. Over the next 2 days, small shifts began to appear. A parent who once lingered in conversation with Claire offered only a brief nod. A faculty advisor observed Ava with new attentiveness. No one said anything openly, yet a subtle distance formed. Social pressure rarely announces itself loudly, it settles quietly, altering atmosphere before anyone can name it. Daniel reviewed Hawthorne Ridge's disciplinary handbook late that night. The procedural steps required formal documentation before any status review could occur. Nothing in the handbook aligned with the tone of the meeting. The unease sharpened into clarity. The concern had not been spontaneous. It had been positioned. As the sun lowered on Thursday afternoon, Daniel retrieved the mail from the box at the end of the driveway. Among advertisements and routine envelopes was a sealed letter bearing the Hawthorne Ridge crest in dark blue ink. He held it briefly before opening it. Inside was a formal accusation, structured and detailed, dated days before the initial meeting request. It had already been written. They thought fear would make him cooperative. They had no idea it made him alert. Authority rarely announces itself as force. It prefers softer language, measured tones, and reassuring smiles that make doubt feel unreasonable. It sits across polished tables and speaks about protection while quietly outlining consequences. It frames fear as guidance and calls pressure responsibility. And in rooms where reputation matters more than truth, concern can become the most refined form of control. The Morgans returned to Hawthorne Ridge 2 days after receiving the formal letter, though the meeting request suggested this conversation was simply a continuation of partnership. The conference room felt identical to before, but something had shifted beneath the surface. The air held a careful stillness, as if every word had already been rehearsed. Headmaster Richard Caldwell greeted them with the same steady composure, his expression calm enough to appear reasonable, firm enough to signal authority. Meredith Langford sat beside him once more, her folder again present yet closed, positioned deliberately within sight but never opened. The language that followed was polished and deliberate. They spoke about maintaining institutional standards. They emphasized stability within scholarship programs. They referenced patterns of concern without identifying specific incidents. Each sentence appeared balanced, crafted to sound neutral while quietly reinforcing doubt. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Instead, there was a steady rhythm of implication that suggested something fragile beneath Ava's otherwise spotless record. No written documentation was placed on the table. The earlier formal accusation was acknowledged but described as procedural necessity rather than judgment. When Daniel asked calmly about supporting evidence, the response remained abstract. Observations had been made. Faculty impressions had been noted. The academy was simply acting proactively. The word standards surfaced repeatedly, woven into nearly every explanation. Standards protected students. Standards preserved excellence. Standards ensured fairness. Yet fairness, Daniel understood, required clarity. The conversation gradually turned toward reputation, though never directly. Hawthorne Ridge, they explained, had cultivated trust over decades. Families expected consistency. Alumni expected integrity. Public misunderstandings could create unnecessary complications. They spoke gently about the importance of handling matters internally. It was suggested that public discussion might unintentionally harm Ava's academic trajectory. Scholarship reviews, they reminded the Morgans, occurred annually and reflected holistic assessments. Fear did not arrive as a threat. It arrived as caution. Claire felt the weight of those cautions more deeply than she showed. She understood social ecosystems. She sensed how easily narratives could spread within private institutions where families watched one another closely. Her instinct was to protect Ava not only from formal consequences but from subtle isolation. She recognized the implication that resistance might carry cost. Still, she remained composed, her posture steady, her voice measured whenever she spoke. Ava listened quietly, her confusion tempered by discipline. She searched for specific mistakes within herself and found none. She had studied. She had competed honestly. She had represented the school responsibly. Yet the more the administrators spoke about balance and wellness, the more she sensed an invisible shadow forming around her achievements. She did not crumble under it. She absorbed it, uncertain how something so vague could feel so heavy. Daniel observed. He watched how Richard's tone softened when discussing community harmony, then tightened slightly when referencing procedural authority. He noticed how Meredith's gaze lowered when Daniel inquired about written reports. He registered the careful avoidance of concrete examples. Every sentence seemed designed to imply concern while preventing direct challenge. Something feels off. The thought returned, sharper now. He understood that institutions rarely rely on explicit threats when subtle pressure can achieve compliance more effectively. He recognized the strategic layering of reassurance and warning. The message beneath the message was simple: cooperate quietly, accept the framing, allow the academy to manage the narrative. Silence, in that room, became deliberate. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not accuse them of misrepresentation. He thanked them for their time. He expressed appreciation for the academy's dedication to student welfare. He requested any available documentation through formal channels. His tone remained respectful. His expression remained calm. Inside, however, a quiet alignment had solidified. Fear framed as protection was still fear. As the meeting concluded, Richard extended his hand with practiced warmth. Meredith offered a composed smile that never reached her eyes. The administrators appeared satisfied, as though the structure of authority had done its work. The language had been gentle. The boundaries had been implied. The responsibility now seemed to rest with the Morgans to respond appropriately. Walking down the corridor, Claire felt the subtle shift in atmosphere. Conversations near the lockers paused momentarily as they passed. A faculty member who once greeted Ava with enthusiasm offered a nod that felt measured rather than warm. Nothing overt had been said, yet something intangible had already begun circulating. In the car, Claire's hands rested quietly in her lap. She did not express panic, but she felt the tightening grip of social pressure. Ava stared out the window, her posture composed but her thoughts unsettled. Daniel drove with steady focus, reviewing each phrase spoken during the meeting, mapping tone against policy, implication against procedure. At home that evening, he added new notes to the growing HRP archive. He documented every repetition of the word standards. He recorded the suggestion that public conversation might damage Ava's future. He logged the absence of written evidence presented during the meeting. His handwriting remained precise. He did not escalate publicly. He did not alert other parents. He did not react emotionally. He chose patience. For Daniel, silence was not compliance. It was clarity forming. Over the next several hours, subtle changes rippled outward. A parent group message referenced the importance of supporting institutional values. A teacher reassigned Ava's leadership role in a minor project without explanation. Each shift appeared small in isolation, yet together they formed a pattern. The narrative was moving. By the time they ended the meeting, the narrative had already begun spreading. Isolation rarely begins with confrontation. It begins with pauses that last half a second too long, with glances that shift away just slightly too quickly. It begins when warmth cools but no one admits the temperature has changed. It moves quietly through hallways and inboxes, through conversations that stop when someone enters the room. And by the time a family realizes it is happening, the distance has already formed around them. In the days following the second meeting, the Morgans did not face open accusation. There were no public statements, no dramatic announcements. Instead, the atmosphere at Hawthorne Ridge adjusted itself in subtle increments, like furniture being rearranged while the lights are dimmed. Claire noticed it first during morning drop-off. A parent who once lingered beside her car window to discuss upcoming events now offered only a brief, polite smile before turning away. Another who had once praised Ava's scholarship journey spoke carefully about how competitive environments could be overwhelming for some students. The words were neutral on the surface. The implication was not. Ava felt the shift inside classrooms. Teachers who had previously engaged her with confident expectation now observed her with a measured caution. Feedback that once celebrated precision became tempered with reminders about balance and emotional wellness. No one accused her of wrongdoing. No one identified a violation. Yet an invisible narrative had begun to surround her, one that suggested fragility where there had once been discipline. Invitations began to disappear quietly. A study group that had met regularly before competitions suddenly adjusted its schedule without notifying her. A weekend planning session for an academic event proceeded without her inclusion. When she learned about it afterward, the explanation was gentle and vague, referencing scheduling confusion. Ava accepted it with composure, but she felt the absence more deeply than she allowed herself to show. Claire carried the weight differently. She sensed the social recalibration happening within parent circles. Group messages referenced supporting institutional standards and protecting the school community. No names were mentioned, yet the timing aligned too precisely to ignore. She understood how reputations could be shaped not by statements but by suggestions. The damage was controlled, careful, and difficult to confront because nothing explicit had been said. Rumors rarely need detail to spread. They thrive on ambiguity. Daniel observed the changes with measured attention. He noticed how quickly the narrative had shifted after the administrators emphasized internal handling and discretion. He understood that institutions often signal to their networks without issuing direct directives. Language travels in tones, not just in words. He returned to the Hawthorne Ridge handbook that evening, reading it line by line with the same discipline he applied to compliance audits at work. The procedures for formal review were clearly outlined. Written complaints required documented evidence. Scholarship evaluations required specific benchmarks and notice periods. Nowhere did the handbook describe informal wellness concerns leading to reputational distancing. He began mapping language against action. Some letters don't just deliver information, they rearrange a family's breathing. Some envelopes don't carry paper, they carry intention, sealed with authority and dressed up as care. Some accusations don't arrive with shouting, because the people sending them believe silence will do more damage. And sometimes the most frightening moment isn't the threat itself, but realizing it was prepared long before anyone looked you in the eye and smiled. The certified envelope sat on Daniel Morgan's kitchen table like something that didn't belong in a home built on steadiness. Claire stood nearby, hands folded loosely, her face calm in the way only a mother can manage when she refuses to let fear become the loudest presence in the room. Ava watched from the hallway, shoulders square, eyes steady, but the air around her felt thinner than it should have. Daniel opened the letter with the same careful restraint he used at work when reviewing high-risk documentation. The pages inside were structured, detailed, and confident, as if the writer expected no challenge. The accusation was framed as behavioral concern, the kind of phrase that sounded compassionate while quietly suggesting instability. It listed dates, referenced observed patterns, and implied that the Academy's interventions were meant to protect Ava from herself. Near the middle, in language polished to appear procedural rather than punitive, it referenced a scholarship status review and the possibility of suspension pending further evaluation. Claire felt the weight of those words in her chest, not because she believed them, but because she understood how easily institutions could turn suggestion into consequence. She knew how scholarship students were spoken about differently, how grace could be offered publicly while pressure was applied privately. Yet she did not break in front of Ava. She did not collapse into despair. She moved closer to her daughter instead, offering quiet steadiness through proximity alone, the kind of gentle support that says, "You are not alone in this, even when the world tries to isolate you." Ava did not cry. She didn't plead or argue. She simply looked at the document as if she needed to confirm it was real, then turned her gaze to her father. There was confusion there, yes, but also a restrained hope, the kind that appears when a child realizes her parents may be the only safe ground left. Daniel met her eyes briefly, not with promises, not with dramatic reassurance, but with calm presence that made space for her fear without feeding it. Daniel read every paragraph twice, not because he was shaken, but because he respected the strategy behind it. The letter was designed to trigger panic. Panic leads to mistakes, and mistakes are easy to frame as guilt. He noted how the language leaned on soft power, community stability, wellness obligations, institutional standards. He noticed how often the word concern appeared, always paired with words that implied authority, review, intervention, compliance, requirements. He also noticed what the letter did not contain. There were no direct quotations from teachers, no incident reports attached, no signatures from witnesses, no mention of the required preliminary steps outlined in the student handbook. The accusations were specific enough to intimidate but abstract enough to avoid accountability. Daniel set the pages down and reached for his laptop. He did not speak much. He didn't need to. Claire understood his silence, and Ava began to understand it too. It wasn't resignation. It was analysis. He started with the simplest truths, dates, timestamps, and sequence. He pulled up the original well-being email, the first meeting invite, and the follow-up response that had insisted everything was informal. Then he compared those timestamps to the letter's stated timeline. Something didn't align. The accusation referenced ongoing observations beginning before the first meeting request, yet the Academy had claimed there were no formal concerns at that time. Daniel saved the files again, preserving them as PDFs and screenshots, capturing headers and metadata. He printed the letter and placed it in the HRP folder, then created a second folder labeled with the date. The routine was calm, almost tender in its precision, as if documentation itself could cradle the family's dignity. Claire watched him and felt something soften beneath her fear. Not relief, exactly, but trust in the steadiness of someone who would not let emotion become the only defense. Ava went to her room afterward and opened her textbooks, not because she felt untouched, but because studying was the one place she still controlled the narrative of who she was. That night, Daniel reread the handbook procedures line by line, matching each clause to what had actually happened. He circled phrases that mattered: notification requirements, evidence standards, response timelines, appeal processes. He highlighted the Academy's obligations as clearly as he highlighted Ava's. The letter had attempted to weaponize fear by sounding official, but Daniel knew official didn't always mean correct. He checked for policy violations in the structure of the accusation itself, then returned to the most human element of all, his daughter's face when she first saw the words. That memory anchored him. Not rage, not humiliation, not revenge, just a quiet commitment to protect without spectacle. In the end, he found what he had expected to find all along, a break in the system's own rules, small enough to miss if you were crying, obvious if you were calm. He found the first procedural error buried in paragraph 3. Institutions are rarely afraid at first. They are confident in their language, steady in their authority, certain that pressure will do what force does not need to. But sometimes resistance does not shout. Sometimes it arrives as a polite letter, carefully cited and professionally structured. And when calm refuses to bend, the fear that was once projected outward begins to turn inward. Hawthorne Ridge had expected discomfort. It had not expected precision. After Daniel Morgan's formal requests for documentation and clarification, the tone of communication shifted almost imperceptibly. Responses became more delayed. Phrases grew more guarded. Where reassurance had once flowed easily, replies now leaned heavily on procedural terminology. The administration sensed that the Morgan family was not reacting in the way most families did. There were no emotional emails, no urgent pleas, no visible panic. There was structure. Behind closed doors, discussions at the academy intensified. Internal communications referenced the need to resolve the matter efficiently. A proposal surfaced suggesting an expedited review of Ava's scholarship status under the pretext of maintaining institutional stability. The language was still wrapped in concern, but the acceleration was clear. The goal was no longer quiet alignment, it was containment. Claire noticed the subtle increase in pressure at school. Ava's schedule was reviewed more closely. Additional wellness check-ins were suggested. A guidance counselor requested informal meetings under the banner of support. None of it crossed into overt punishment, yet the frequency felt strategic. It was as though the institution hoped repetition might produce fatigue. Ava remained composed. She attended classes, completed assignments, and participated in discussions with the same disciplined calm she had always carried. If she felt the tightening atmosphere, she did not dramatize it. She had learned from her father that steadiness can be its own language. Teachers observed her closely, perhaps searching for instability to justify earlier concerns, but found only consistency. Daniel filed a formal procedural inquiry with the Academy's Board of Trustees, referencing specific handbook clauses and attaching documented discrepancies. The inquiry was not accusatory in tone. It simply requested clarification regarding deviations from stated policy. The language was careful, almost respectful, yet firm in its expectation of transparency. Simultaneously, on his attorney's guidance, Daniel notified the regional educational oversight body responsible for accreditation compliance, forwarding documentation and requesting a neutral review of procedural adherence. The step was not dramatic. It was deliberate. The Academy's legal counsel was looped into the matter within days. Communication from Hawthorne Ridge began, including a compliance officer copied discreetly on replies. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. What had begun as a well-being conversation was now a documented procedural review with potential regulatory implications. Tension rose quietly behind administrative doors. The Academy could not easily retract its earlier documentation. Internal emails, once written casually about risk mitigation and scholarship optics, now existed within a formal inquiry. Administrators who had spoken confidently weeks earlier began recalibrating language, careful not to imply motive or misjudgment. The pressure they had intended to apply outward was returning, measured, and persistent. At home, however, the Morgan family remained publicly calm. Claire continued attending school functions with quiet grace, refusing to mirror the institution's guarded posture. She spoke kindly when addressed and did not entertain rumor. Her composure unsettled those who expected defensiveness. Ava focused on her studies, her resilience deepening not through defiance but through patience. She began to understand that dignity does not require spectacle. Daniel maintained routine. He went to work, returned home, organized files, and updated timelines. He documented each administrative response, noting subtle changes in phrasing. He observed how quickly the academy shifted from informal concern to legal caution once oversight was involved. He did not celebrate the shift. He recognized it as confirmation that structure matters. The oversight body acknowledged receipt of his inquiry within a week, requesting additional documentation. Daniel provided it promptly. There were no emotional appeals in his submission. Only policy references, timelines, and attached evidence. The review process would take time, he was told. Institutions moved slowly when examining themselves. Meanwhile, the academy attempted one more quiet maneuver. A notice was issued scheduling an accelerated scholarship review meeting, citing emerging information. The timing coincided precisely with the oversight body's confirmation email. It was an effort to resolve the matter internally before external review advanced too far. Daniel responded with a composed letter requesting that any review occur only after the procedural inquiry concluded, referencing due process obligations. His attorney copied the academy's legal counsel. Silence followed for several days. Within Hawthorne Ridge, confidence had begun to thin. What once felt like controlled narrative management now carried potential consequence. The pressure that had been directed at one scholarship family now hovered over administrative decisions. Faculty members who had been cautious with Ava began softening again, sensing the uncertainty above them. Power structures do not crumble loudly. They reveal cracks in tone, in hesitation, in the sudden awareness of accountability. One afternoon, as Ava left her final class of the day, she noticed something small but telling. A teacher who had avoided extended conversation for weeks paused to ask about her upcoming competition, offering encouragement that felt genuine rather than procedural. It was not a dramatic shift. It was a human one. At home that evening, Daniel received an email from the Oversight Board requesting a formal response from Hawthorne Ridge within a specified timeframe. The message was neutral, procedural, and clear. Then the Oversight Board responded. Justice does not always arrive with applause. Sometimes it walks in quietly, carrying nothing but facts and leaving everything changed. Sometimes truth does not shout, it waits until the room is still enough to be heard. And sometimes the most powerful victories are the ones no one celebrates out loud, because dignity was never meant to perform. The Oversight Board's response did not accuse Hawthorne Ridge of wrongdoing. It did something more unsettling. It requested a comprehensive internal review, including documentation of procedural adherence, communication logs, and scholarship review criteria applied over the past academic year. The tone was neutral, almost understated, yet its implications were unmistakable. What had once been a contained narrative was now subject to structured examination. Within days, internal communications that had previously been withheld were formally disclosed as part of the review process. Email threads surfaced that confirmed what Daniel had pieced together quietly at his kitchen table. Conversations referencing optics, risk mitigation, and preemptive framework development appeared in writing, timestamped before any outreach had been made to the Morgan family. The timeline manipulation, subtle but measurable, was no longer theoretical. It was visible. The Academy's strategy to manage reputation before addressing substance became clear in the documentation. Rather than initiating direct dialogue or gathering transparent evidence, administrators had first discussed potential scholarship reassessment scenarios. The language was polished, framed as precautionary planning, but the order of operations spoke louder than the words themselves. The concern had been constructed before it was communicated. There was no explosive confrontation. No dramatic admission of fault. Instead, a quiet recalibration began within the institution. The accelerated scholarship review meeting was formally paused pending the outcome of the oversight evaluation. Language in official correspondence softened. References to behavioral instability were replaced with acknowledgments of procedural review. The Academy's legal counsel recommended internal policy clarification before further action. Claire read the updates with a calm she had grown into over the past weeks. She did not feel triumph. She felt relief, tempered by a quiet sadness that such effort had been required simply to preserve fairness. Ava listened as her parents explained that the scholarship was secure while the review concluded. She nodded slowly, absorbing the information not as vindication but as reassurance that truth had weight. At school, the atmosphere shifted again, this time in subtle restoration rather than subtle exclusion. Teachers resumed ordinary engagement. Parent conversations regained natural rhythm. The unspoken narrative that had once hovered around Ava dissolved without formal announcement. No one apologized publicly. No assembly was called. The correction happened in tone, in posture, in the quiet absence of suspicion. Administrative accountability unfolded without spectacle. The Oversight Board recommended internal compliance training and policy revisions to ensure clearer communication protocols in future scholarship evaluations. A confidential memorandum acknowledged process misalignment in handling Ava's case. Certain administrative responsibilities were reassigned. It was not dramatic. It was procedural. Daniel did not seek public acknowledgement. He did not forward internal emails to parent groups or request statements of apology. He declined the temptation to narrate the Academy's missteps. He understood that protecting Ava's future required stability, not exposure. Justice delivered cleanly leaves fewer scars. One afternoon, Headmaster Richard Caldwell requested a private meeting with Daniel and Claire. The tone was different now, less rehearsed, more measured. There was no theatrical apology, but there was acknowledgement of procedural oversight and commitment to policy refinement. Daniel listened without interruption. He accepted the acknowledgement without embellishment. He did not humiliate. He did not lecture. He simply affirmed the importance of fairness for all students, not just his own. Claire sensed something shift in that room, not power, but humility. Institutions rarely admit miscalculation easily. Yet accountability, even when understated, can create space for growth. She chose grace over resentment, recognizing that bitterness would only prolong what had already cost them energy. Ava returned fully to her academic rhythm. Her scholarship status was formally confirmed in writing, secure and unchanged. The letter arrived without ceremony, yet its simplicity felt restorative. She placed it in her desk drawer without dramatic reaction. Her resilience had deepened, not hardened. She had learned something about systems, about silence, about patience. But she had also learned something about protection, that love, when steady, can withstand even structured doubt. In the Morgan home, the HRP folder remained intact, not as a trophy but as record. Daniel archived the final correspondence with the same discipline he had applied from the beginning. He did not destroy the documents. He preserved them, understanding that memory matters. There were no speeches at the dinner table. No declarations of victory. Only a shared quiet that felt lighter than before. Claire placed her hand gently over Daniel's one evening, gratitude unspoken but understood. Ava smiled more easily again, the tension that had shadowed her expression replaced by renewed confidence. The Academy continued functioning. The plaques remained polished. The brick building stood unchanged. Yet something within its processes had shifted, subtly, permanently. Accountability had entered quietly and done its work without spectacle. Justice delivered cleanly does not seek applause. It restores balance and steps aside. But Daniel was not interested in revenge. He was interested in protection. Silence can look like surrender to those who misunderstand it. It can resemble weakness to those who rely on noise. But sometimes silence is not absence, it is preparation. Sometimes it is the quiet gathering of courage, the patient shaping of boundaries, the steady refusal to let fear decide the ending. And sometimes the most powerful statement a father can make is not spoken at all, but lived. The weeks following the oversight review did not bring celebration to the Morgan household. They brought clarity. Hawthorne Ridge initiated quiet policy reform as recommended, refining language in its scholarship evaluation procedures and establishing clearer documentation standards for future concerns. The revisions were not publicly broadcast, yet they were real. Daniel reviewed the updated handbook when it was released, reading each clause with the same disciplined attention that had guided him from the beginning. He saw where ambiguity had once allowed interpretation to outweigh fairness. Now the structure was firmer, less vulnerable to manipulation. The reform was not presented as an apology. It was framed as institutional growth. Daniel accepted that framing without resistance. His objective had never been humiliation, it had been protection. Claire understood this deeply. She watched her husband close the HRP folder one evening and place it in a secure cabinet where it would remain permanently archived. Not hidden. Preserved. Documentation, for Daniel, was not about reliving conflict. It was about honoring memory and ensuring accountability could never be erased by convenience. Ava felt the shift most personally. The hallway glances that once carried uncertainty now carried ordinary familiarity. Teachers addressed her with restored confidence. Her scholarship letter remained unchanged, reaffirmed in writing with clear language and explicit terms. She placed the confirmation into her desk drawer with a quiet smile that did not need audience. Her confidence did not return in dramatic waves. It rebuilt itself slowly, through routine, through restored rhythm, through the absence of suspicion. Claire's quiet strength revealed itself most clearly during this period. She did not seek validation from other parents who had distanced themselves. She greeted them with the same warmth she had always offered, neither colder nor overly forgiving. Her steadiness became its own statement. In private moments, she reflected on how fear can ripple through communities faster than truth, and how easily people align themselves with authority when uncertainty arises. Yet she did not carry resentment. She carried understanding. Fear makes people cautious. Dignity makes them brave. Daniel requested one final meeting with Headmaster Caldwell, not to reopen wounds but to establish long-term clarity. The conversation was measured and forward-looking. Boundaries were discussed with calm professionalism. Daniel emphasized transparency in future communications and requested that any concerns involving scholarship students follow documented procedural steps without deviation. There was no accusation in his tone, only expectation. The headmaster agreed, acknowledging the importance of trust moving forward. The institutional narrative gradually corrected itself. Faculty training sessions addressed communication standards. Scholarship guidelines were clarified in newsletters sent to families. The language no longer leaned on implication. It leaned on specificity. Though no public reference was made to Ava's case, the culture subtly shifted toward greater care and process. At home, evenings felt lighter. Conversations returned to ordinary topics, college aspirations, academic competitions, future plans. Yet something deeper had settled within the family. They had experienced the weight of implication and survived it without spectacle. They had navigated fear without surrendering their values. Daniel reflected quietly one night, sitting at the same kitchen table where the first documents had been spread. He understood that silence had been misunderstood from the beginning. To some, it may have appeared as compliance. In truth, it had been calculation rooted in patience. He had not stayed quiet because he lacked strength. He had stayed quiet because he believed timing matters more than volume. Ava began mentoring a younger scholarship student the following semester, offering encouragement without recounting her own ordeal in detail. She spoke about resilience and consistency, about trusting process and believing in oneself even when perception shifts. Her guidance was gentle, not heavy with warning. She had chosen grace over guardedness. Claire watched both of them and felt a sense of quiet pride. Not because they had won, but because they had remained intact. Fear had knocked. It had entered politely. It had tried to rearrange their footing. but it had not defined them. The lesson was never delivered in lecture form. It lived in action. Silence is not weakness. It is preparation. Patience is not passivity. It is strategy. Documentation is not distrust. It is memory preserved. As months passed, Hawthorne Ridge continued operating with its polished exterior. Yet within its structure, a subtle recalibration remained, a reminder that systems are strongest when they are transparent. Daniel did not seek recognition for that change. He simply ensured it existed. The Morgan family moved forward without spectacle, their dignity intact, their boundaries firm. They did not relive the conflict. They did not narrate it publicly. They carried it as quiet wisdom. They tried to silence his family with fear and carefully chosen words. He answered with patience, timing, and truth. And when the consequences came, they arrived quietly.